There are moments in television history that transcend the medium itself, moments where the carefully constructed walls between entertainment and raw human emotion collapse entirely. This is the story of one such moment. A moment that began with an ordinary taping day and ended with Phil McGraw, a man renowned for his unshakable composure, standing frozen on his own stage, unable to speak, unable to move, as the impossible unfolded before his eyes. The morning started like countless others at the Paramount Studios lot in Hollywood. Crew members shuffled through their routines with practiced efficiency, checking lighting rigs, adjusting camera angles, running sound checks. The makeup artists prepared their stations, the production assistants distributed call sheets, and the audience coordinator began the process of seating the day's guests. Nobody suspected that within hours, they would witness something that would fundamentally alter how they understood their jobs, their show, and perhaps even themselves. Dr. Phil arrived at 7:45, exactly as he had for nearly 3 decades of television production. He reviewed the day's lineup in his dressing room, sipping black coffee from his usual mug, scanning through research packets his team had prepared. The episode's theme was family estrangement, a topic the show had explored numerous times before. 3 separate families would share their stories of disconnection, anger, and the desperate hope for reconciliation that had brought them to national television. Standard fare. Nothing that suggested the day would become anything other than routine. The first family's segment went smoothly. A father and son who hadn't spoken in 8 years managed a tearful embrace after Dr. Phil guided them through the layers of resentment and misunderstanding that had kept them apart. The audience applauded warmly. Tissues were distributed, and the production moved seamlessly into a commercial break. The crew reset the stage, adjusting chairs and checking equipment while Dr. Phil consulted with his producers about timing for the remaining segments. The second family was scheduled next. According to the production notes, it involved a daughter named Rebecca Morrison, 34 years old, who had cut off contact with her mother 15 years earlier. The file indicated that Rebecca had experienced what she described as emotional abuse throughout her childhood, patterns of manipulation and control that had eventually forced her to choose between her mental health and her relationship with her mother. The mother, listed only as Janet in the preliminary paperwork, had declined to appear on the show, according to the correspondence on file. Rebecca would tell her story alone, seeking validation and perhaps advice on how to process the guilt that accompanied her decision to walk away. Rebecca was mic'd up and seated on stage. She was a composed woman, a pediatric nurse with 2 children of her own, dressed professionally in a navy blazer and simple jewelry. As the cameras began rolling again, she spoke with the measured tone of someone who had spent years in therapy processing her experiences. She described a childhood where affection came with conditions, where approval was weaponized, where love felt less like a gift and more like a performance review that she could never quite pass. Dr. Phil listened with his characteristic intensity, nodding, asking clarifying questions, digging beneath the surface of her words to understand the patterns that had shaped her life. The audience was engaged but not unusually so. This was familiar territory, painful but navigable, the kind of conversation that happened on the show regularly. Rebecca explained that she had written letters to her mother over the years, attempts at communication that went unanswered. She had invited her mother to meet her grandchildren, offers that were rejected with cold silence. Eventually, Rebecca stopped trying. The door had been closed from both sides. "Do you ever imagine reconciliation?" Dr. Phil asked, leaning forward in his chair with that penetrating gaze that had become his trademark. "Do you think about what it would take for you to allow your mother back into your life?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I used to fantasize about it constantly," she admitted. "I'd imagine her showing up at my door, apologizing, acknowledging the hurt she caused, telling me she'd changed. But that's all it is, a fantasy. My mother doesn't believe she did anything wrong. She's convinced I'm the problem, that I'm ungrateful and cruel for keeping her grandchildren away from her. There's no common ground when one person refuses to acknowledge reality." Dr. Phil nodded slowly. He was about to respond, to offer one of his characteristically direct observations about accountability and change, when something unusual happened. A production assistant appeared at the edge of the stage, moving with urgent but controlled energy. She caught the eye of the floor director, who immediately signaled to Dr. Phil with a subtle gesture that meant they needed to pause. Dr. Phil's expression flickered with brief confusion, a rare break in his professional facade. In 3 decades of television, interruptions like this were extraordinarily uncommon. He held up a hand to Rebecca, offering her a reassuring smile, and turned toward the backstage area where his senior producer was emerging. headset askew, tablet clutched in her hand. "We have a situation," she said quietly, stepping close enough that the audience microphones wouldn't pick up her words. "Someone just arrived at the security gate. She's claiming to be Rebecca's mother. She has identification and she's demanding to be let in. She says she needs to speak to her daughter." The color drained from Dr. Phil's face, not from fear but from the instant recognition of how delicate this moment had become. His mind, trained by decades of crisis intervention and family counseling, immediately calculated the risks. An unplanned confrontation on live television, a daughter who had spent years building boundaries, a mother who had been told she couldn't participate but had come anyway. This could go very wrong, very quickly. He glanced back at Rebecca, who was sitting in her chair looking puzzled and concerned, unable to hear the whispered conversation happening several feet away. Dr. Phil made a decision. He walked over to Rebecca and knelt beside her chair, speaking in a low, gentle tone that the boom microphones barely captured. "Rebecca, something's happened that I need to tell you about, and I need you to stay calm and trust me, all right?" His voice carried the weight of absolute seriousness. "Your mother is here. She's at the security entrance. She apparently drove here from Arizona and wants to come onto the set. She wants to talk to you." Rebecca's reaction was visceral and immediate. Her entire body tensed, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair until her knuckles turned white. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, the physical manifestation of 15 years of trauma and self-protection activating in an instant. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, no, I can't. I didn't agree to this. She can't be here." Dr. Phil placed a steady hand on her arm. "You're absolutely right. You didn't agree to this, and you don't have to see her. That's completely your choice, and I will respect whatever you decide. But I want you to take a breath and think about this for just a moment, because this is your decision to make, not mine, not the show's, not hers, just yours." The studio had gone completely silent. The audience, sensing something unprecedented was unfolding, sat motionless. Camera operators held their positions, but exchanged glances. The crew members who had been preparing for the next segment stopped their work entirely. Every person in the building suddenly aware that whatever was happening on that stage mattered in ways that transcended television. Rebecca looked up at Dr. Phil with eyes that held both terror and something else, something that might have been a tiny fragile spark of curiosity. "Did she say why she came?" Her voice cracked on the question. "Did she say what she wants?" Dr. Phil shook his head. "The only information I have is that she drove through the night to get here, that she knew you were appearing today, and that she's asking for a chance to talk to you. But Rebecca, and I mean this, you owe her nothing. If you want her turned away, if you want to continue with your segment exactly as planned, we will make that happen. Your boundaries matter. Your healing matters. You get to choose." The seconds stretched out, heavy and profound. Rebecca closed her eyes, and those watching could see the war happening inside her. 15 years of hard-won independence and self-preservation battling against the primal, childlike hope that maybe somehow her mother had actually changed, that maybe the woman who had caused so much pain had somehow found the capacity for remorse, for growth, for the kind of love Rebecca had always craved but never received. When Rebecca opened her eyes again, they were filled with tears, but her voice was surprisingly steady. "I'll see her. But I need you to promise me something, Dr. Phil. I need you to promise that if this goes badly, if she starts the same patterns, the same manipulation, you'll intervene. I can't do this alone." Dr. Phil nodded solemnly. "You have my word. And Rebecca, you're not alone. You're surrounded by people who are here to support you, including me. We're going to do this together. And we're going to do it on your terms." What happened next would be discussed in production meetings, journalism classes, and therapy sessions for years to come. Dr. Phil turned to address the audience directly, his voice carrying a gravity that silenced even the most subtle background noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to experience something that was not planned. Something that involves real people in real pain attempting real communication for the first time in 15 years. I'm asking for your respect, your silence, and your support for both of these women as they navigate something extraordinarily difficult." The stage manager positioned herself near the entrance where Rebecca's mother would enter. Dr. Phil returned to his seat but remained on the edge of it, every muscle in his body conveying readiness to intervene if necessary. Rebecca sat rigid in her chair, her hands now clasped so tightly in her lap that they trembled visibly. The door at the side of the stage opened and a woman entered. She was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt that suggested she had indeed driven through the night without stopping for rest or preparation. Her face bore the marks of age and stress, deep lines around her eyes and mouth. But what struck everyone in the room was her expression. It wasn't defiant or angry, it was terrified. She stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes finding Rebecca across the expanse of the stage. For a moment, mother and daughter simply stared at each other, separated by 15 years of silence and 30 feet of studio space. Neither moved, neither spoke, the weight of everything unspoken, everything damaged, everything lost hung in the air like a physical presence. Dr. Phil broke the silence with careful gentleness. "Janet, thank you for being here. Why don't you come and sit down?" He gestured to a chair positioned several feet from Rebecca, close enough for conversation but far enough to provide space, to allow Rebecca to maintain the boundaries she needed. Janet moved forward slowly, almost hesitantly, a stark contrast to the domineering figure Rebecca had described in her stories. She sat down carefully, perched on the edge of the chair as though ready to flee at any moment, her hands twisted together in her lap, mirroring her daughter's nervous gesture. "Janet," Dr. Phil began, his voice firm but not unkind, "you weren't invited to be here today. Rebecca had made the decision to share her story without your presence. So I need to start by asking you directly, why did you come? What made you drive through the night, show up uninvited, and put your daughter in this position?" Janet's eyes filled with tears immediately, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I've been watching my daughter love her life from the shadows for 15 years, and I'm drowning in what I've lost." She looked directly at Rebecca, for the first time since sitting down. "Because I got a letter in the mail 2 weeks ago, and it changed everything." Rebecca's expression shifted from rigid defensiveness to confusion. "What letter? I didn't send you any letter." Janet reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out an envelope, worn from repeated handling. "It wasn't from you, it was from your daughter, from Emma, my granddaughter." Her voice broke completely on those last 2 words. "She found my address somehow. She wrote to tell me that she's learning about family trees in school, and she wanted to know why there's a grandmother she's never met. She asked me if I was dead or if I just didn't want to know her." The revelation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. "Emma wrote to you. She never told me. She never said anything." "She's 9 years old, Rebecca," Janet said, tears now streaming down her face. "And she's wondering why her grandmother doesn't love her. And I had to sit in my kitchen, holding this letter from this beautiful child I've never met, knowing that the answer is that her grandmother loves her desperately, but her grandmother is also the reason her mother can't have grandmothers in her life at all." Dr. Phil leaned forward, his entire demeanor intense with focus. "Janet, what are you saying? Are you taking responsibility for the estrangement? Because in our research, in the correspondence we reviewed, you've consistently maintained that Rebecca was the one at fault, that she was ungrateful and punishing you unfairly." Janet's face crumpled. "I know what I've said. I've been defensive and angry and self-righteous for 15 years because admitting the truth felt like dying. But reading Emma's words, seeing her innocence and her confusion, I realized that I'd rather die than let another generation suffer because I'm too proud to admit what I've done." The silence in the studio was absolute. Every person present understood they were witnessing something rare and precious, genuine accountability, the moment when someone chooses truth over self-protection, regardless of the cost. Rebecca was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, but she remained still, waiting, needing to hear more before she could allow herself to hope. "What exactly are you admitting, Janet?" Dr. Phil pressed, his voice gentle but unyielding. "I need you to be specific. For Rebecca's sake and for your own. What are you taking responsibility for?" Janet turned fully toward her daughter, no longer addressing Dr. Phil or the cameras or the audience, speaking only to Rebecca. "I controlled you. I manipulated you. I made your childhood about my needs instead of yours. When you wanted to make decisions I didn't approve of, I made you feel guilty and small. When you tried to establish boundaries, I punished you with silence and withdrawal. I told you that you were selfish when you were actually just trying to be your own person. I made love conditional on obedience, and I called it good parenting when it was actually emotional abuse." Rebecca's sobs became audible now, her entire body shaking with the force of emotions she had kept carefully contained for years. But she didn't look away from her mother, didn't close herself off. She listened. "I got defensive when you tried to talk to me about it because I couldn't face what I'd done," Janet continued. I convinced myself that you were exaggerating, that you were too sensitive, that you were influenced by therapists who didn't understand our family. I blamed everyone except myself because looking in the mirror was too painful. And when you cut off contact, instead of using that as a wake-up call to change, I used it as evidence that you were the problem. I played the victim to everyone who would listen, and I actually believed my own lies. Dr. Phil sat back slightly, his expression showing both professional assessment and genuine human emotion. What changed, Janet? What made you capable of seeing this truth now when you couldn't see it before? Emma's letter asked me one question that I couldn't answer with excuses or deflection. Janet said, her voice steadying slightly as she worked through her own understanding. She asked, did I do something wrong to make you not want to meet me? And I realized that my granddaughter was internalizing my mistakes, was blaming herself for something that had nothing to do with her. And I thought about Rebecca at 9 years old, wondering why her mother's love felt so painful and confusing, wondering what she had to do to be good enough. And I finally understood what I'd done. Rebecca spoke for the first time since her mother had entered, her voice thick with tears, but surprisingly strong. I need to know if you understand why I left. Not just that you did things wrong, but why I had to protect myself by cutting you off completely. Janet nodded emphatically. You left because staying was killing you. You left because I gave you no choice. You left because you were finally brave enough to choose your own well-being over my comfort. And that was the healthiest, strongest, most necessary thing you could have done. You weren't punishing me, Rebecca. You were saving yourself. Dr. Phil intervened gently, addressing Rebecca directly. How are you feeling right now? What's happening for you as you hear your mother say these things? Rebecca took a shuddering breath, wiping her eyes with the tissue someone had placed in her hand. I feel like I've been holding my breath for 15 years, and I'm finally exhaling. I feel terrified that this isn't real, that it's another manipulation, that I'm gonna let my guard down and get hurt all over again. But I also feel something I haven't let myself feel in a very long time. I feel hope.
The hope is scary, isn't it?
Dr. Phil observed quietly, because hope makes you vulnerable. Yes, Rebecca whispered. Because if I hope and I'm wrong, it will break me all over again. And I've worked so hard to put myself back together. Janet spoke again, her voice urgent but respectful. I don't expect you to trust me. I don't expect you to let me back into your life right away or maybe ever. But I'm asking for the chance to show you, through actions and time and consistency, that I've changed. I'm in therapy now, real therapy where I'm actually doing the work instead of just complaining about you. I'm reading books about emotional abuse and narcissistic behavior and generational trauma. I'm learning about attachment and boundaries and how to love someone without controlling them. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands, showing the screen to Rebecca. This is my therapist, Dr. Patricia Lawson. I've given her permission to speak with you if you want verification that I'm actually engaged in this process. I've been seeing her 3 times a week for the past 2 weeks since I got Emma's letter, and I'm committed to continuing for as long as it takes. Dr. Phil interjected with important clarity. Janet, I want to acknowledge something significant here. 2 weeks of therapy, while commendable, is just the beginning of what will need to be a long-term commitment. Change, especially change in deeply ingrained patterns, takes time. Rebecca, you need to hear this too. Your mother's recognition and willingness to get help is meaningful, but it's not a guarantee, and it doesn't erase what happened or obligate you to anything. Both women nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. Dr. Phil continued, addressing the audience as well as the 2 women before him. This is what accountability actually looks like. It's not pretty or dramatic, it's uncomfortable and vulnerable and uncertain. It requires the person who caused harm to sit in the reality of what they've done without defensiveness or excuses. And it requires the person who was harmed to decide on their own terms and their own timeline, whether they have the capacity and the desire to allow for the possibility of rebuilding. He turned specifically to Rebecca. What do you need right now? What would feel right for you in this moment? Rebecca looked at her mother for a long moment, her expression complex and shifting, showing the internal calculus of risk and possibility, fear and longing. Finally she spoke. I need time. I need you to understand, Mom, that this doesn't fix everything. This doesn't mean we go back to how things were or suddenly have a relationship. But I'm willing to consider the possibility that maybe someday, if you continue to do this work and show me through consistent actions that you've truly changed, we might be able to build something new. Not what we had before, but something healthier. That's all I'm asking for, Janet said, fresh tears falling. A possibility, a chance. I'll wait as long as it takes, and I'll respect whatever boundaries you set, and I'll prove to you that I'm serious about this." Rebecca took another deep breath, and then in a moment that caused audible gasps from the audience, she stood up. Janet stood as well, uncertain and waiting. Rebecca took 3 steps forward, closing half the distance between them, but not all of it, maintaining the space that represented her boundaries, her autonomy, her right to proceed at her own pace. "I'm not ready to hug you," Rebecca said clearly. "I'm not ready to say everything's okay. But I'm willing to acknowledge that you came here, that you said things I've needed to hear for 15 years, and that you're taking steps toward change. That matters." Janet nodded vigorously, her hands pressed against her chest as though physically restraining herself from reaching out. "Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for not walking away immediately. Thank you for being open to possibility." Dr. Phil stood as well, positioning himself where he could address both women and the audience. "What we've witnessed here today is extraordinarily rare. It's rare for someone to break through their own defenses and acknowledge harm they've caused with this level of honesty. It's rare for someone who's been hurt to be willing to remain open to the possibility of healing. Both of these things require tremendous courage." He looked at Janet seriously. "I'm going to give you some direct advice. Get ready, because this is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. Real change in these patterns requires you to consistently choose discomfort over defensiveness. Every single time, when Rebecca sets a boundary, your instinct will be to feel rejected and respond with hurt or anger. You're going to have to feel that feeling, sit with it, process it with your therapist, and then respect the boundary anyway. When she doesn't respond to your messages or needs space, your instinct will be to push or withdraw dramatically. You're going to have to resist both impulses and simply wait with patience and respect. This will feel unbearable at times, but it's the only path to rebuilding trust." He turned to Rebecca. "And you need to hear this too. Protecting yourself isn't cruel, and changing your mind at any point isn't failure. If you try this and discover that the relationship isn't healthy or that your mother isn't following through, you have every right to step back again. Forgiveness isn't a cage that traps you in unhealthy dynamics. It's a process you get to control completely." The episode ended not with a dramatic reconciliation or a television perfect hug, but with something more honest. Rebecca and her mother exchanged phone numbers through Dr. Phil's team, agreeing to supervised communication through family counseling sessions. They left the stage separately, respecting the space Rebecca needed. But as Janet reached the exit, Rebecca called out one word, "Mom." Janet turned, hope and fear mingling on her face. "Thank you for hearing Emma," Rebecca said quietly. "Thank you for letting her voice reach you when mine couldn't." Janet nodded, unable to speak through her tears, and left the stage. Dr. Phil stood alone under the studio lights, looking directly into the camera, with an expression of profound solemnity. "Today you witnessed something that doesn't happen often enough in families or in life. You saw someone choose accountability over self-protection. You saw someone else choose to remain open despite justified fear. Neither of these choices guarantees a happy ending, but they make it possible, and sometimes possibility is all we need to begin healing." The aftermath of that episode rippled outward in ways nobody anticipated. The show received thousands of messages from viewers who had experienced similar family estrangements, many of them expressing that seeing accountability modeled so honestly had inspired them to examine their own roles in broken relationships. Mental health organizations contacted the show asking for permission to use clips in training materials about accountability and genuine apology. Rebecca and Janet's story became a case study not because it had a perfect resolution but because it didn't. Because it showed the messy, uncertain, difficult reality of attempting repair in damaged relationships. 6 months later, Dr. Phil invited both women back for a follow-up episode. The update was neither entirely triumphant nor tragically failed. Rebecca and Janet had been meeting monthly with a family therapist, working slowly through decades of pain and pattern. Progress was incremental and sometimes frustrating. There had been setbacks, moments when Janet slipped into old defensive behaviors, and Rebecca had to reinforce boundaries firmly. But there had also been moments of genuine connection, conversations where both women felt heard and understood in ways they never had before. Most significantly, Emma had met her grandmother, supervised visits that were carefully structured to protect everyone involved. Rebecca watched her mother with her daughter with vigilant care, ready to intervene at any sign of the controlling behaviors that had defined her own childhood. But what she saw instead was a grandmother who asked questions and listened to answers, who respected it when Emma said she needed space, who offered affection without demands attached to it. "I can't become the mother you needed when you were young," Janet said during the follow-up episode, addressing Rebecca directly. "I can't change what happened or give you back the childhood you deserved. But I'm trying every day to become the grandmother Emma deserves. And maybe eventually the mother you can have a relationship with now, as adults on terms that feel safe and healthy for you." Rebecca's response was measured and honest. "I don't know if we'll ever have a close relationship. The damage was deep, and trust takes years to rebuild, especially when it was shattered so thoroughly. But I'm grateful that Emma gets to know you as a different version of who you were with me. And I'm grateful that you're doing the work, even when it's hard, even when you don't see immediate results. That consistency matters." Dr. Phil's closing thoughts on the follow-up episode addressed the broader implications of what these two women had demonstrated. Reconciliation isn't always possible, and it's not always advisable. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to maintain distance from people who hurt us. But when someone genuinely commits to change, when they're willing to do the uncomfortable work of examining their behavior and altering patterns that have defined them for decades, that creates possibility. Not certainty, but possibility. And for families who want to heal, possibility is where hope begins. The final image of the follow-up episode showed Rebecca and Janet sitting side by side, not touching but present together in the same space without hostility or tension. Emma's letter, the catalyst for everything that followed, was displayed on screen with the child's permission. Her innocent question, "Did I do something wrong?" had become the question that finally broke through a grown woman's defenses and allowed truth to emerge. In the years since, Dr. Phil has referred to that unexpected moment when Janet walked onto the stage as one of the most significant experiences of his career. Not because it was dramatic or shocking in the traditional television sense, but because it was real. It demonstrated that people can change, that accountability is possible, that hope can exist even in relationships that seem permanently broken. The episode became required viewing in family therapy training programs, used as an example of how to navigate the delicate territory between hope and protection, accountability and forgiveness, damage and repair. It showed that healing isn't linear, isn't quick, isn't guaranteed, but is possible when people choose courage over comfort. For Rebecca, the journey continues. Some days she feels optimistic about the possibility of having a relationship with her mother. Other days the old wounds ache, and she needs distance to protect her peace. She has learned that both responses are valid, that healing isn't about reaching a permanent state of resolution, but about developing the tools to navigate the ongoing complexity of relationships that have been damaged and are attempting repair. For Janet, the work of change remains constant. She continues therapy, continues examining her patterns, continues practicing the uncomfortable discipline of allowing her daughter autonomy even when it triggers her own insecurities. She has learned that being a better person isn't a destination you arrive at, but a practice you commit to daily, regardless of whether you see the results you hope for. And for Emma, now a teenager, she has watched her mother and grandmother navigate something difficult with honesty and care, modeling for her what it means to set boundaries, honor them, take responsibility for harm caused, and remain open to growth. These lessons will shape her own relationships for the rest of her life. The moment when Dr. Phil stood frozen on that stage, recognizing that something unplanned and potentially transformative was unfolding, represents what television can be at its best. Not escape, not entertainment, but witness. A space where human beings in all their complexity and contradiction struggle toward truth and connection in real time, reminding everyone watching that change is hard and uncertain and absolutely worth attempting.